proceed to our panel discussion, which will be moderated by Prof. Cheong. Okay, so our Prof. Cheong and our panelists are already on stage, but let me do a brief introduction of our panelists this afternoon. We have Mr. Peter Ho, Chairman of the Urban Redevelopment Authority, Professor Jason Pomeroy, Founding Principal of Pomeroy Studio and Pomeroy Academy, Mr. Abhas, Practice Manager for Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management at the World Bank, and of course, Professor Ricky Burdett. Over to you, Prof. Cheong.
Okay, thanks very much, Samuel. Well, I think this is really a gathering of friends, so it's very hard to get you all to get back to your seats. I think we all miss each other after a long time, so it's really nice to see. And I do hope you can stay back a little bit later and carry on with your chats and conversations with each other. But thanks very much again for coming. I think we've already heard Ricky's lecture on shaping cities and an urban age, and I really enjoyed the lecture that he delivered. And we also talked about the challenges of cities. And in fact, in the World Economic Forum meeting at Davos this year, there were 4 interwoven crises that were highlighted. And I think Ricky also highlighted some of them. It's about high inflation, an energy crisis, food poverty, climate crisis, and of course, not to mention that actually we're still struggling to get back from COVID. It's not gone, it's still around, you know. And then the food and energy crisis are now further exacerbated by the Ukraine war. And of course, over lunch with Ricky, Prof. Chan and myself were chatting about, you know, all these geopolitical tensions that just keeps adding to the very difficult times that cities are facing. So it seems that we're headed for a perfect storm. So how can cities be better prepared, and what are the key actions we should take? So I'm really pleased that today we have with us quite a diverse panel, a range of interests that they have, and to give us some insights, perhaps into the expert areas and areas that they're interested in. I think they've already been introduced, Mr. Peter Ho, Jason, we have Mr. Abhas, and of course Ricky, so I won't go into the detail of the very long and impressive CVs. So to begin, I will pose some questions to the panelists, and after which we will open up the session, and I do encourage you to ask them questions, maybe difficult questions, more difficult than mine, so that we can have a good conversation, all right? So perhaps now I start with Peter, whom I've known a long time, and he's a great thinker. And I know Peter always used these words, no? He always warned us of an increasingly volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. If you've heard his lectures and read his books, you see these words coming up a lot. And he has lots of metaphors on black elephants, black swans, wicked problems, which highlight the enormous challenges faced by governments. So I'm just going to ask him a very simple question. So, Peter, what do you think are some key actions that governments can take to better prepare for the future? Now, do you have your... Yep, got it.
Thank you. Can you hear me at the back, or am I off? Yeah, okay. Yeah. Right. Thank you very much, Koon Hean. This issue of the world we live in today as VUCA world. VUCA is not my term. It's a term coined by American strategists during the Cold War. Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Carries with it very serious implications for those of us who are in the business of thinking about the urban setting planning for cities. You think about the kind of infrastructure which Ricky presented there. It's a serious commitment, not just in terms of the capital outlay, but once you go on that path, you're committed to it for decades, if not for centuries, like the London Underground. So you got to know what you're getting yourself into. And the problem with living in a very uncertain world is that you can be sure of only one thing, that you will continuously be surprised and shocked. You know, we talk about black elephants. Black elephants are a particular manifestation of this propensity to be surprised and shocked, and that is we all have cognitive biases. We have a lot of blind spots. We see the elephant in the room. The elephant could be something like a pandemic, but you wish it would go away. You pretend it's not there. And then when the proverbial thing hits the fan, you pretend as if it's a black swan. But the problem was always staring at you in the first place, and you've done nothing about it. That's your black elephant. So if we accept that we have going to be shocked from time to time because of our cognitive biases, because of the changes that are taking place in a way that human beings cannot discern where the next surprise is going to come from, then we must think about how we are going to cope with shocks that happen. And it's almost impossible to plan for shocks because these are unknown unknowns, your black swans. And when you get into this kind of thinking, then you really need to rethink the whole way you plan for the future, where there's a certainty only of being shocked and surprised, which means you have to start thinking about this idea of resilience. If you're going to be surprised, you're going to be shocked, you don't necessarily have planned for it, but something is going to happen, and you need that kind of capacity to deal with surprises and shocks. That means you cannot think of a system that is purely efficient in terms of the resources you allocate to it. If you think you are going to plan for a city in which the temperature is going to rise at a very steady rate to 4 degrees centigrade by a certain period of time, yes, that may be good enough, but supposing that transformation happens within a much shorter period of time, then you're going to be shocked. And then do you have the capacity to correct, to adjust, and to bounce back? This requires, in a way, a type of government and a type of governance that I don't think we spend enough time. It means there must be some spare capacity in the system. There must be some ability to deploy that capacity when the shock comes, which is often unanticipated. And we think of COVID-19, we know. There's a lot of demand on the system, and many governments, many countries, many cities have been found wanting because they didn't have that spare capacity built in. They didn't have that resilience. So I would say the principal lesson I would take away from this question of a VUCA world is we better spend a lot more time thinking about resilient systems. And is our planning resilient enough? The URA and the CEO of URA is sitting there, does a long-term plan. It used to be called a concept plan. They think 40, 50 years ahead. And it used to be a linear projection. It generally works quite well. But now, because of the nature of accelerating change, because of the greater uncertainties in the world today, they are adopting a somewhat different approach. They look at scenarios, different trajectories that could occur in the next 50 years. And these trajectories don't just involve obvious things like climate change, population growth, but also things like climate change and the economy. What happens if your projections don't quite work out the way you expect? Then is your infrastructure adequate? Can you make the adjustments if there are surprises along the way? So that's a new way of thinking about our long-term plans, and that's one way of dealing with the issue. So maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Peter. You actually anticipated my second question. I was going to ask you, so with the long-term plan, what sorts of adjustments, are you making to your planning approach? So I think you have already touched on something very important, to be looking at scenarios. Having been involved in the long-term plan of Singapore many times, it's also not very easy. Maybe that's something we could talk about, because having different scenarios requires buffers. And then how much buffer do we really have to do some of these things? So it's really not an easy task for the URA. Thanks, Peter. Now I'm going to move to Jason. Well, Jason, being an architect, I think I'm going to ask you a question more related to cities, the design of cities. So, with the major changes arising from the pandemic, and then now you see, we talk about the future of work and the adoption of remote working and the possibility of deglobalization trends, if you believe in that. Not everybody believed that we were deglobalized. Will cities actually continue to thrive? And what is needed to actually secure good outcomes for cities?
That's a great question. I think the evidence is there already, what Prof. Burdett was showing earlier. We see this continued trend towards sort of inner city growth. We know that 3/4 of the world's population will be living in city centres by 2050. And I guess cities have always been this opportunity for convergence, this opportunity for people to come together in trade, in commerce, to be able to hold political rallies, religious sermons, the ability for us to connect. And if you were to kind of look at the city growth as a 30-centimetre ruler, and if you were to kind of track the various contagions, pandemics, crises across the world, these are millimetre blips on that 30-centimetre ruler, whether it's the 17th century plague, whether it's the 19th century cholera outbreak, whether it's the Spanish influenza of 1918, whether it's SARS, and now whether it's the pandemic. Despite this, these millimetre blips on the 30-centimetre ruler of life, we will always want to converge in cities, and they will continue to grow because people want that element of prosperity, the ability to make something of themselves, and we are drawn to cities for that element of spontaneity. And that's what I find fascinating about cities. That's why I think that they are incredible hubs, incubators, and the way that Singapore is treating itself as a living laboratory as well. It then comes down to ensuring that there are the mechanisms to do so. And when I kind of think about what happened during the pandemic, it's curious that those smart cities, those smart nations that were able to turn to big data, were able to use the data very wisely. They were able to get to a point where they can start employing services very rapidly. It leads into that point about what Charles Schwab said about agile governance, the ability to sandbox ideas and test ideas in the city, as opposed to deploying mass resources and potentially facing the financial consequences of deploying those resources. But those cities that are able to test new innovations and ideas, like in Singapore, I think is very, very important for the future growth of those cities. And ultimately, what we see through the pandemic, or whether we see through energy crisis, or whether we see through the conflicts of war, we see that cataclysms can act as a catalyst for growth. And during the COVID pandemic, I think that there was this embrace of technology wisely in order for us to continue that element of communication, that element of connection. It's just a question of now ensuring that we do not get overtaken by the technology, because everybody kind of, well, listen, I'm sure you all faced it as well. You all did return to Netflix, didn't you, during the lockdown? We need to ensure that we can manage the technology and the data usage wisely.
Well, thank you, Jason. In fact, we're trying very hard to make sure people come back to work and actually interact, because everyone is so used to staying at home. I was just listening to a BBC program, and there's this very interesting conversation, about people who actually don't really want to come back, you see, versus
Absolutely.
the people who think that you have to come back.
And
but
that
maybe just...
Well, that provides that opportunity for choice then, doesn't it? Doesn't it empower the
provides,
individual to
yeah.
kind of make the right decisions? For instance, you do not have to be in the office to be making those back-to-back calls all day long. You can be doing that remotely. And I think that this period has actually made us more conscientious about when we step back into those places in order for those connections to take place.
Probably the answer is somewhere in between, I
think so.
suppose.
It is.
But I want to ask you a follow-up question. It's just that even the LKYCIC is doing studies on really what makes cities appealing, you know. You know, there's been a lot of talk about with the pandemic, you know, there's a change in lifestyle and work. And some people actually move away from the city. So the issue really is, I mean, I think most of us here believe in the cities, right? Believe in in the importance of a city and that people will be drawn to a city. Maybe just the follow-up question really is, what do you think makes cities and its places very deeply appealing over time to people?
I think it's a combination of being spontaneous and having culture at its root. And it's lovely to see the final slide that you had, which basically showed the V&A and various other elements of arts and culture. I mean, when you think about culture, it's not just arts, but it's also those time-tested rituals. It's those past traditions. It's the layers of history that can be imbued in the bricks and mortar. I mean, growing up in London, I used to love going to Brick Lane, going to the Huguenot Chapel in the 18th century, which was basically created for those escaping France. By the 19th century, this chapel had become a synagogue by the Jewish immigrants. By the 20th century, it became a mosque for the Bangladeshi immigrants. These layers of history leave a tale of a culture, and I think that's really important to reflect. So try to be able to ensure that there is that possibility of spontaneity within the city that reflects time and culture is incredibly important. And I would say also in this 21st century era of digital transformation, it's a culture of innovation as well. How can you be sort of providing those platforms for people to be the entrepreneurs that they want to be in the cities? Cities have always been a place for trade and commerce. Put the tools, the digital tools, almost like digital guilds, a reinterpretation of the medieval guilds, put the tools in the hands of the individuals. That will actually foster new economic communities in themselves within the city.
Thank you. A lot of food for thought. Well, we'll come back to some of these issues perhaps later. Maybe I turn our attention to Abhas. Abhas, as we all know, comes from the World Bank. He's a practice manager for climate change and disaster risk management. And so, Abhas, you know all about this. Cities are really facing the wrath of climate change. I mean, just look at the news over the last couple of weeks. Tremendous floods, Pakistan. And then we've had droughts, on the other hand, in some other cities. I mean, in Europe, right? It was so hot. Even the Rhine is drying up. So I think these are really extreme weather episodes of drought, heat, and devastating floods we see. So we talked about resilience, and I think Peter spoke about that. So how do you think cities can increase their urban resilience?
So thank you, Koon and Hean for this invitation. And thank you to Professor Burdett for his very excellent speech. And also, he leads the LSE Cities program, and we've hired many excellent people in the World Bank from that program. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. So I wanted to talk very broadly on the theme of resilience. You mentioned climate change, but actually I see three big challenges. And of course, for each of Professor Burdett's slides, you know, we could talk hours, but just focusing on three at this point. So one is climate change, as you mentioned, Koon. So as we speak, 1/3 of Pakistan is underwater. My team is working day and night. It is quite an unprecedented situation. So the province of Sindh got more rain in one day than they normally get in a year. And this is not just Pakistan. So the northeast of India and northern Bangladesh was underwater last month. And then this was preceded by heat waves. So there's a city in Pakistan called Jacobabad where the temperature hit 50 degrees centigrade. That's a temperature where humans cannot exist. And that is becoming more and more common. There's a study out of MIT by Professor El-Tahir, which shows that even under the low emission scenario, parts of Asia will become uninhabitable because of heat. So this is clearly not a black swan, but it's what they call a gray rhino, which is something that's coming at you and you're sort of being willfully blind. So I think that's one sort of set of issues. The second is what Professor Burdett talked about in his talk about the rapid urbanization. And, you saw those numbers of, 56, 70 people per minute moving to cities. But if you looked at, per hour, sorry. But if you looked at that map, what was striking is that you're seeing the maximum population growth in the areas which are precisely least capable of managing this kind of growth. So parts of Asia, parts of Africa, which are extremely poor, they don't have capacity. So just take one metric of urban planners. I was told that the entire Philippines, they produce 100 planners in a year. That's a startling number, no? Because they probably need tens of thousands of planners. And this is not to beat up on the Philippines. It's true across. It's true of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, anywhere. So you have this problem of capacity and managing this explosive urban growth, which is the second challenge. And then the third challenge, I would say, is about jobs and growth. We talked about AI and automation, but there is a big question now is that where is the jobs of the future going to come from? Because manufacturing will not play the role that it played in the past. So, you have the China and sort of even in Singapore is these East Asian tigers, right? Where manufacturing kind of drove this explosive growth. But it's increasingly clear that manufacturing can no longer play that role. Because of automation, because of onshoring and other factors, you're seeing this premature deindustrialization. So India is already starting to deindustrialize. They sort of leapfrogged from agriculture, going straight to services. But the problem is that services don't create these good jobs for low-skilled people. So that is the big question mark. Where are the jobs going to come from in Asia, in Africa? And where is the growth going to come from? And frankly, we don't have many of these answers. So maybe I'll stop here and we can talk about solutions later.
Yes, I was going to ask you, where have you found some good solutions and examples, Maybe we should be looking at cities that might have found some way to have some breakthrough solutions for this. So thank you, Abhas. I think your job, you do see many of these challenges. So it'll be interesting to see how the World Bank might actually be supporting some of the cities as well. It'd be good to hear you talk a little bit about that later, maybe, right? Ricky, thank you so much for the lecture. I'm sure I speak for many here who really enjoyed it. Some of the issues are really brought starkly to home. So my question to you really is then, what do you think are the most urgent transitions that cities need to make? You talked about governance. Maybe I just follow up and ask you, so what do you think are the roles of government, the private and the people sector to help to achieve these transitions? So which are the most urgent transitions? Then what are the roles that each can play?
Well, in talking earlier about governance, I didn't for a moment want to exclude the private sector. I think one of the roles of governance, of good governance, is to manage the different voices, the different constituencies, which in a city represent not just the ruling elites or the public sector, but certainly, those who invest in cities. You look out the window left or right, in my city, your city, what is it, 80, 90% of the building stock is private individuals or companies who either build on a... Now, of course, with the URA and the HPD here, it's a slightly skewed version simply because so much public money actually goes into these developments and all for good, with good effect. But back to your question, I certainly think that the role of good governance is to invite the private sector, the individual and the investor into this longer-term vision. Now, I think Peter's point earlier is right, which is what vision can you actually set out when you don't know what's happening tomorrow morning? In other words, the age of uncertainty. But except I think you were saying, Peter, that there is, as long as we create a more nimble system, we can actually probably accommodate the shocks. But we have to be aware that we need more elbow room. What I would add to that in terms of your question about transformation is it's not just a question of, let's call it decision-making, investment, infrastructures and using infrastructure in a non-physical way. It's also about literally the shape of the city on the ground. I mean, I think the more and more I look at cities, some cities are just inflexible. So when they get a shock, they've had it. I mean, think of what will happen to Dallas, that if something happens, a flood, a crisis in years from now in terms of birth rate. I mean, choose it, pandemic, right? Clearly, some physical systems, this brings us back to planning and your very interesting point about the lack of capacity in those very areas of the world that require it. I do think that we need to foreground also the physical infrastructure planning in such a way that can absorb that change. Now, we don't have to go very far. Most cities in the world, which have been around for 2,000 years, whether it's Jerusalem or Rome, where I was lucky to be brought up the first 20 years of my life, have a capacity to change. That's why retrofitting is just as important as I guess, new planning. I mean, can Karachi adapt itself, say, so I think the response to your question about transformation and priorities, I would bring the physical back up alongside governance, I mean, as opposed to separate from.
Right. Okay. I'm going to open the session up to the audience, and I do hope that you will ask some questions, because the panel is here. Is very not often that we can convene a panel like this. So may I just ask whether there's anyone who would like to ask questions, pose a question? Particularly to all the, okay. We've got two. They are all very eager, and even Hing Chi. But I'm going to give it first to Scott. He was the fastest. And because he cycled here all the way from his office. And he set a good example for us.
I'm not wearing a jacket because of that. No, actually, it's kind of a follow-up on what you're just talking about related to governance. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the form of government or governance. And you showed a few different diagrams earlier on the structure of governance, and the type is more conducive to creating better livable outcomes for cities. And in your research in that, is there a certain type that is more conducive to that in terms of allowing for that flexibility?
One always has to be careful to, have the silver bullet that works everywhere, because, I think all of us are stressing that there's no one thing as a city. There are many different types of cities. It depends whether you're in, parts of Africa which are growing at an extraordinarily rapid rate without any form of well-organized, or capacity, as you called it, political management, or you're talking about declining nations in Eastern Europe, which have a lot of capacity, but no one there, but I guess I would say, nonetheless, that the more we look at cities, at LSE cities over the years, there are probably two or three things, rather than the perfect model, that matter. One is, and those maps sort of showed it, to have some sort of, let's call it, alignment between the jurisdiction, the powers of the elected figure who runs that city, mayor, governor, whatever, manager, that you have an alignment where people live and work and pay their taxes, right, where that jurisdiction actually is incredibly important. Because if your constituents are, live on the other side of the border, whatever border in terms of, state, if you live in the proximate city borough or something like that, you're not going to get that, I guess, belief in the longer-term vision that a mayor may set and contribute to it. So, the point Peter made, these are massive decisions being made to invest in transport. Do you believe it? I mean, on the Californian model of voting for proposition X or Y, do you believe it? You want to go, I mean, I just was in Switzerland last week, they vote on everything. and within the canton, including whether to have mosques or whether to develop something. So I think partly the answer is where people live and work and having a jurisdiction which represents that, and then having an authority, elected authority, who can dispose of the income generated by taxes and be kicked out after 5 years if they're not good enough or they don't do what they do. And of course, going back to your point, Abhas, the problem with the African city, let's call it that, or the poorer end, is that there is this growth, rapid growth, population growth, with absolutely no capacity, because of the reasons that we're talking about now, for anyone to raise any money. So where does the payment for the transport come from? I mean, certainly not from the normal process of taxation. So mayor, yes.
Yes, please, Abhas.
So just to add to Ricky's points, so there are two iron laws of government. I used to work in the government of India, first at the state level and then at the national level. There are two iron laws of government. One is that every level of government thinks the level below is corrupt, incompetent, totally useless. That's number one. And number two, no one gives up power willingly. Those are the two. Any country in the world, it's true. So once you have these two laws, then how do you design effective government around that? So I think going forward, one of the biggest challenges that the world faces is how to do effective metropolitan governance. And frankly, some countries have got some distance, but there's no perfect model. But what we have found is that if you design a metropolitan agency around a particular service, and transport is often a good example, and if the national government puts enough subsidy behind that, it has a good chance of succeeding. And you have many examples of that. But again, it's a very, very difficult process, and it has to be iterative because you are going to make mistakes on the way.
Yes, I think I can understand that it's about not just the governance, but it's the structures around government, because you also have different administrations that keep changing. So what provides that stability, right? It's really the entire administrative structure. I'm going to invite Peter. Peter has some comments.
This is a question that we could spend a lot of time discussing, but there's an aspect I think I would like to take to try to get a perspective on your question, and that is, which cities have longevity? That's not a commentary on whether they've got good governance, bad governance, or good planning or bad planning. But there are some cities which have, in history, survived over very long periods of time. Singapore, of course, often compares itself to Venice, and Venice lasted for something like 700 odd years as a very successful city. And there are comparisons to be made between cities in the United States. And one of the examples of a city that has sustained itself over a very long period of time despite repeated shocks is Boston. And if you compare Boston to, say, cities like Detroit, which have focused on developing great strengths in one thing, which is cars, the automobile industry. I don't know about the quality of governance, but the fact is, for a while it was extremely successful. But when the automotive industry came under severe challenge, Detroit didn't have that adaptability and flexibility to respond. Whereas Boston, over centuries, faced a number of shocks, including the first shock, which was a shock to its maritime position. Then after that, shocks to its industrialization, and then after that, it replaced that with the education sector, and it's still continuing on that trajectory. And the question then is it about government or is it about some other factors as well? And I think one of the critical factors that makes a city successful in terms of longevity, not necessarily in terms of quality of life, but longevity, is what some call economic complexity. If a city is diverse and has diversity in terms of economic capability, then when something surprising happens, more likely than not, the complexities of its economic structure allows it to make reconnections. It's like, you know, your brain gets damaged, your brain somehow rewires itself, and something new, something fresh comes out. Whereas, say, a city like Detroit, which is just one thing, it's got no spare capacity to rewire itself and come up with something new. So this is something which I think, if you are in the business of government, you should think about. And I say this without prejudice to the Urban Redevelopment Authority, because there's also a risk in over-planning. Because you're trying to anticipate everything. Actually, you cannot. And maybe you should allow 1,000 flowers to bloom a bit, allow a bit of untidiness, a bit of messiness, because it's that very messiness that may give a city, an urban setting, that capacity to stay around for much longer periods of time and to reinvent itself time and time again. So it's just an observation.
Can I just add? It's Ricky. Sorry.
Yes, sorry, Ricky.
No,
Yeah.
just on this point, the Harvard Growth Lab, I don't know if you're familiar with that, has just done, over the years, developed a methodology to capture exactly what you're talking about, Peter, and it's actually a website called Metaverse. And effectively, Metaverse, not Facebook. No. And it actually tries to maybe rationalize what you just said in a very intuitive and powerful way of what the skills a city has. And it actually talks about Boston and Detroit, that Boston has skills in its people, which are educational, biotech, medical, et cetera, so that it can actually respond to. Detroit only invested in one. It's interesting just to totally support what you're saying, that cities need that varied, complex, slightly messy capacity.
All right, thank you. Jason, any comments?
I mean, it reminds me of when we're thinking about case studies, Amsterdam is a wonderful example of agencies coming together, but 4 spheres of influence. You have civil society basically saying, I think I have an idea, and I think this will be good for the city. I think it will be good for the people. You've got corporations, industry, willing to get behind those ideas, to think there might be money to be made out of this, which will be good for the city, but also good for the corporation. You've got academia, willing to test, hone, shape, create proof of concepts. And then you've got the state to regulate, to ratify those ideas. So the Amsterdam Metropolitan Institute, I think, is quite a remarkable little case study in itself. I mean, MIT had done a series of studies about autonomous boats, for instance, to be able to utilize those waterways. And I think the increasing crowdsourcing of people's inputs are another example in Asia, which I think we should consider. Think about Bandung as a remarkable city. Bandung and the former mayor of Bandung basically said, well, I may not have $2 to rub together, but I do have a lot of constituents who follow me on Twitter. So why don't you just tweet me what your issues are? And the ability to kind of sift through those trending topics, which were often about pollution, crime, congestion, flooding, that his constituents were tweeting him about, allowed him to use the algorithms through a digital command center to sift through the trending data to say, okay, this is where we need to solve those issues. And all of a sudden, you've got constituents, people, thinking, I'm actually being listened to. And I think the ability to sort of bring the people along this journey, a bottom-up crowd swell, as well as the balancing of government and governance from a top-down position, I think is increasingly important.
Thank you. Wow, quite a lot of things to think about. We talked about governance, but it's also both bottom up as well. And Peter's point about resilience is about diversity. Sort of makes me think why Singapore did not totally move into a service economy, that we always have a certain percentage of, say, manufacturing, for example. But, okay, that's another big, long story. Now I'm going to ask Hean to ask a question, followed by Wen Tong. All right? Okay, so, sorry.
I've got the microphone as well.
Right, I did see you. I did see your hand.
That
All right.
hand went up quickly, and I've got the
Sure.
microphone, so I'm going to use it. I want to get back to the point, Ricky, your presentation was really mind-blowing, and I find it difficult to sit still for a couple of minutes, so you got my whole attention, so well done. I was really shocked by a statistic you whacked at, which is 1 in 3 of the world's population live in a slum. And we're living in unprecedented times. We've got climate refugees, we've got economic refugees, we've got war refugees. So those people are presumably going to rock up in cities that are not well placed to receive them. And they're not going to go into sort of Park Lane fancy housing. I guess they're going to go to the slum. So are slums growing? Question one. And what do we do with slums? I mean, if the answer is we're going to move to a more inclusive society and educate people, but we don't know what the future of work is, wow. So what do we do? Are slums growing, and what do we do?
I think Abhas is better placed than me to answer that because of what to do. But it is back to Peter's point, which is to have those things which are about to become cities, because that's not, some of them are not yet, mature infrastructures of decision making, whatever. To supply them with the capacity and the resources to manage these processes, I think is certainly one way to start, but it's nearly an impossible task, sorry to say. I don't see it being solved. It's interesting that organizations like the UN, the World Bank, I'm sure similarly, for many years didn't even focus on the urban poor. Most of the reports were about the rural poor. That's fine. And there has been a sort of argument that if you forget about the urban poor, then what happens? It becomes too late. It becomes sort of infested somehow. So I don't have a positive answer, I'm sorry to say. I don't feel optimistic.
Abhas?
So if I understood your question, it is what should we do about slums? Is that your question?
Or how do you avoid it?
Yeah, I think it was slums are growing, presumably, and what do we do? And sorry, just get back on Ricky's point. We've seen various solutions, haven't we? London was a crazy slum-ridden city at various points all the way through the 20th century. One answer was really just to move people. So put them in a bus and then drive them to unpopulated areas, which isn't an answer either, right?
So this is one area where, development economics is such a messy business where there's no consensus on anything, but on slums, surprisingly, we know a lot about what should be done and what can be done. And in fact, Asia has a lot of examples of very, very good, very effective slum upgrading programs. So Vietnam is a great example. Indonesia has had the KDP for 30 years. And at the essence, what is a slum? A slum is a failure of land markets. That's it. It's because your land markets are not working. That's why people come and squat illegally in precarious conditions. Now, if you look at, say, 30 years ago, the consensus was that, send the bulldozers in, kick them out, as you said, send them, 50 miles away. And then we discovered that just doesn't work because people will just come back. So now I think, the consensus is a few things. So one is in situ upgrading. So essentially make the conditions of where they are much better, providing sanitation, water, decent housing. And you should not treat it as an expenditure, more like an investment, because these people are providing essential services to the city. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that sometimes the zoning and regulation in cities are unrealistic. You have, not to pick on any one city, but say Jakarta or Metro Manila, you have the standards of, say, London or Paris, and that's completely unrealistic. So if you look at, say, Vietnam, that's a good example of where they have, very, I wouldn't say loose in a bad way, but in realistic zoning laws. So if you look at photos, you'll see these tube houses in Vietnam, which are these tiny. It's because it's allowed under the zoning and regulation. And that's another good way of sort of dealing with that. But again, at the basis, it's about how do you solve the land market problems. And we have a good sense of how to do it, but politically, sometimes it's very difficult to do it.
Always back to politics. So, Hing-Chi? Yeah.
Yes. My question is on governance too. In fact, when Scott asked the question, I thought he stole a bit of my question. And I like the answers that Ricky produced and Abhas, which is that to get good cities, a starting point is to get the jurisdiction and the boundaries to coincide. You know, and also you raise this very pertinent question of people don't want to give up power, you know, and that's crucial. So how do you empower cities? How do you change boundaries? It's very hard, you know. But there's one more point, I think, which makes for good cities, and that is continuity of city leadership. If mayors can stay for a long time, you know, Richard Daley, Bloomberg himself, they stayed for a long time, and you can produce good cities. Latin American cities, as we know, you know, you can't run for more than one term, so what can you do to build the city? So my question to you, relating to governance, is this. The talk seems to be quite depressing of what you can do, but over these, let's say just this decade, have you seen cities improve? Have cities in fact improved? I think the answer is yes. How do they improve, and how do mayors learn to improve their cities, you know? Is there sharing of best practices, C40 and so on? So maybe you could tell us more of the good stories. And also London seems to be doing very well. Maybe I'm wrong, I don't live there, you know, but you've had a succession of pretty good mayors. Yeah, the guy who brought in the Olympic, I forgot his name. Then you have Boris Johnson, and you have Sahad Javid, and you've got a new guy now. Why have you managed that? They are different people, you know, so there are two questions there. Have cities learned from each other? Are they doing better? And secondly, you know, in the same thread of thinking, why is London a well-governed city? Or maybe it's not.
Well, I'm sure we can share the first question amongst all of us, but I mean, Medellin, which you've recognized here, is the classic example. The murder rate capital of the world 20 years ago. It's now become a tourist destination for urbanists. Right? How did that happen? Because effectively one person who was the mayor became the governor, Sergio Fajardo, who basically believed that he needed to turn the city round. And it wasn't the bottom-up process. It was this guy had a vision, I'm going to change it, I'm going to invest in safety, education, and so on. So in that sense, we all have to learn from that. Doesn't mean we do the same thing, but so. In London, I mean, it's very important to go back. So everyone, I don't know how many of you in the room realize that the mayor of London is a new thing. It started in the year 2000. Why? Because a certain political leader called Margaret Thatcher, who you might remember, didn't like a man called Ken Livingstone, who was rather left-wing, who was not a mayor of London. He was elected as the leader of the Greater London Council. And that was, in other words, not directly elected by the population, but by the council members, so indirectly. Ken Livingstone was quite left-wing, quite radical. It didn't help that he put up a banner in front of the House of Parliament every day saying the number of unemployed people that were being created by the Thatcher government. So what did she do? She abolished that system of government. She got rid of metropolitan governments in London in 1985. So by the time Tony Blair was elected leader of the Labour Party, and they were won the 1997 election, on his manifesto say, we will have for the first time ever democratic accountability and a five-year term for a mayor of London. And by the way, you can be re-elected without limit. So if they're successful, like Richard Daley or whatever. Why have we had good mayors, you're sort of saying? Well, I thought 1 and 3 are okay. I don't think Boris was a good mayor. I think Boris positioned himself to end up doing what he wanted, which is to give himself a sort of extraordinary platform. If you're the mayor of London, you know, you're on every newspaper, every news channel every night, and to become prime minister. That was his agenda. And I trust in the fact that London has an extraordinarily sophisticated electorate. There are very good checks and balances in the system. So the Mayor of London is elected directly by the people, and the Greater London Authority is there to just make sure that the mayor doesn't misbehave. I mean, that's literally otherwise the mayor is the executive who gets on and does things. I think much is to do with the fact that the powers of the mayor have actually increased gradually over time. So then the mayor didn't have, the first mayor, Ken Livingstone, didn't have power, for example, over housing. Now they do, but none of them do, and one day they might or should have powers over education, which is where I think is another important factor. But
maybe I want to add on to what Ricky has said. I know I'm the moderator, but I can't help making the comment because I've looked at several cities, and I think one of the problems about changing administration is a real problem. In fact, South America is a real problem. I think some of the cities have addressed it because one term is just impossible. You cannot do anything. I think now it's changed to 2 terms. Not too much better, but better. But one of the success factors really, when we look at many cities, wearing my other hat on the Lee Kuan Yew World City Prize, where I chair the nominating committee, I found that number 1, leadership is very important. And what is governance? Governance is really about also putting in place the checks and balances and also developing the right institutions that go beyond the life of the present and subsequent governments, mayors that will just come and go. So having, building up institutions is very important. So of course, we are fortunate to have institutions like HDB, URA, you know. It's that certain continuity. And it's also about building into the system longer-term thinking plans, as much as you can, even as the mayors change. So the countries that seem to have, the cities that seem to have longer-term plans with very good institutions that carry those plans forward, regardless of which mayor comes in, does seem to have a better chance of getting a lot of these plans implemented. So I think there are things that you could do, right? And it's interesting in New York when you have Bloomberg, right? And you have also successive mayors. But there was the New York plan that was done. And the mayor knew that he will not be there forever. So what he did was, in a way, a very different approach. He took a very ground-up approach and developed the New York plan. And this is through consultation of just thousands of people. And then it is institutionalized in a certain way with a reporting system. He knew that even if he's no longer the mayor, the next guy that comes along, he's being held accountable by the people who developed the plan. So there are many ideas like that that different cities can take because they're just different, right? It depends on the politics of the day as well. Peter, you say something?
I'm tempted to come in here because I think the more interesting question is why cities have succeeded in spite of bad mayors and bad governments. That's, I think, in some ways, a far more interesting question. And you can think of cities like New York or London, which have survived bad mayors. They have succeeded perhaps because of good mayors, but also they have survived in spite of bad mayors, bad governments, bad policies. They have survived wars, all kinds of catastrophes. And one of the very interesting questions, apart from the economic complexity part which we spoke about earlier, is how certain cities have either by design or by just sheer luck become global hubs. Because the most successful cities have one common characteristic: they are hubs. And the most durable and the most successful of these become the global hubs. So global hubs like New York, global hubs like London, Tokyo, no matter what happens there, they are going to survive. And what is the characteristic of a global hub that helps them to stay? It's a power law. Once they become successful, they keep on attracting talent. They're talent machines. They suck in the best. So the best will want to go to a place like New York. The best will want to go to a place like London. And it's not just the best in the country. It's the best in the world. They will try to go to these places. And it is this talent, I think, that keeps sustaining it in spite of. And they will go even if the mayors are bad. The mayors will come and go, but that city will stay. That's in their image. And so the question then is quite fundamental. Does it really matter in the long term what type of government you have? Or does it matter even more that you are a global hub? So cities like Singapore, we are not global hubs, but we should aspire to try to become global hubs, because that's an additional factor that will ensure our longevity, our survival, and our success. So it's something to think
I just
about.
how do you apply what you've just said to Jakarta or Manila?
Yeah, so Jakarta and Manila, I would say, are not quite there yet, because they haven't developed that hub standing. They are big cities, but they're not hubs.
Right.
And then hubs then become global hubs. What is a characteristic of hub? It's a connector. It has to connect to the talent. It means you must have that basic infrastructure, which is very critical for hub. Good communications, the support infrastructure to service that connections, and this includes your telecoms, your airport, your seaport. Now it's the internet. All these kinds of things become very important, and it's a never-ending race. You've got to keep on doing it, and those who have an appreciation of that importance of a hub will try to keep on growing it. So cities like Jakarta and all that, they are big cities, they're important cities, but they're not hubs, not yet. Maybe they'll get there, I don't know. But Jakarta is planning to move to a new
Nusantara.
Nusantara. So,
But that's another story.
That's another story.
We move to Nusantara as another story, I think. Now, I'm going to give Wen-Tong a chance because he's been patiently waiting.
Okay.
So Wen-Tong, please.
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to frame my question in terms of the demographics, because I think cities are geared for growth and they've always been growing. But if you look at the demographics for at least the developed world, we're all aging and the TFR has been dropping. Now, South Korea has dropped below 1 and Singapore is very close, 1.1. So we're technically at around the replacement rate. So within 1 to 2 generations, if you want to keep the same population, half the population has to be new. So for many of the cities, it has been rural-urban migration, but that reaches a certain point where it gets, can it be sustained? Because even in countries that are not so welcoming of immigration like Japan, you already see holding out of some of the villages and the towns. Then for cities like Singapore, where we are city-state, then the answer is immigration. But if you imagine for immigration, then we have to bring in half the population over 2 generations will be new. How welcoming and what kind of tension will that happen? Because we talk about VUCA world, we talked about where are the jobs coming from. There will be a lot of insecurity in the existing population. And then as Chairman has talked about, if the talent that's coming in, they are all coming in different, they are all well qualified, but in effect, it leads to a gentrification at the national or the city level. It's no longer at the neighborhood level. So where's the people who are displaced going to go? Then, so do you guys have examples for cities who have managed this kind of large-scale gentrification well? And if so, how can we manage it? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. I think it's the demographics. It also drives the changing nature of the city, right? As you attract people and the so-called indigenous group is reducing. How do you deal with this integration? Jason?
Well, I'm curious because I think it's a fantastic question. And I couldn't help but think of Barcelona as an example of being able to retain talent, young entrepreneurial individuals who are basically given the chance to be able to create their own companies and organizations and products and innovations through these fabrication labs. Now, it was an initiative by a gentleman called Thomas Diaz, and it was a partnership with the IAAC school, an Institute for Advanced Architecture, where he was conscious about the potential for brain drain. Why not retain that young talent, put the tools into the hands of these individuals to create their own companies? And ultimately, what he's done is effectively set up a network of fabrication labs now. Fabrication labs that are there within the communities in Bali, as one classic example in Asia, dotted around the world so that it is there to retain the talent. And arguably, when you think about Shenzhen as a bit of a powerhouse, the Silicon Valley of hardware, as they nickname it, that came out of Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms. The ability to try and retain the talent, create companies like DJI drones, like Tencent, and effectively then become the powerhouse economy that it is today. So I would like to think that the ability to leverage knowledge and then talent retention and giving them the platform through policies to create their own businesses will actually help spur those local economies forward.
I think it's the tension, right, that Wen Tong is also talking about. I think it's great, want to bring the talent, but you know there's a tension. So I suppose the question is really, how do you manage this tension? I'm just going to ask whether anyone has an answer to him before I move on to another gentleman there who is also waiting patiently so that I don't drag out the discussion as well. Abhas, please.
So I certainly don't have an answer, but I do want to say that your question is a very good one, but it's incredibly difficult. And in fact, Professor Burdett's colleague in LSE, Alejandro Rodriguez, he's written a paper called The Revenge of the Places Left Behind. And that's in the context of Brexit, of course. But earlier the consensus was that place-based policies don't work. So we should invest in people, we should not invest in places. In fact, Ed Glazer had written a very nice, slightly tongue-in-cheek piece called Let Buffalo Die, where he's talking about Buffalo, the city upstate New York, and he's saying, who cares if Buffalo dies? Just move everyone out to New York City. I don't think he was serious in that, but that kind of shows you the thinking. But I don't think that's correct at all. And now we know that place matters, and then you're getting into areas which are very sort of, from an economist's point of view, wishy-washy, like identity or, sense of belonging. And frankly, we don't have good answers to these questions, but they're incredibly important and they're incredibly difficult. So in the years to come, I think these are the kind of things we're going to be struggling with.
Okay, I think that is a very, very long topic. We won't dwell into it. But I think there are also a lot of micro ground-up issues. It's just that I deal a lot with the community when I was in HDB. Integration is an important subject, but it is also very much at the people level, not just top-down policy. So I think it can be done, but it's not easy, right? May I just have could you introduce yourself?
Of course.
Hi.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is SK, and I'm faculty in the School of Public Health in NUS. I look at health systems, trained as a medical doctor, now looking at health systems. My question comes from a health systems perspective. COVID has caused the health system to gradually deconcentrate and decentralize so that we can distribute the resilience. My question is, should governments actively encourage de-urbanization, however you define de-urbanization? Because although there are advantages to cities, there are also disadvantages like traffic jams, to inequality, to maybe even overconsumption of resources. So my question is, should governments actively encourage de-urbanization? Thank you.
No.
Thank you. With all the city people here, it's a good last question. So let's just run through. Ricky. The
No.
champions of cities.
Sure, I'll engage.
I says no. No, I'm kidding.
I mean, also because, what you've just said we're not even post-COVID, right? And actually the shift from Western Europe to here, there no one wears a mask. Here, some of you do. And therefore, you're closer to not the end, but nearly there. I mean, the evidence is that actually the decentralization has actually not happened, right? In general, it's not that London has emptied out, or that there was a temporary shift from the Upper West Side to Rochester County or whatever. I mean, I don't think that happens. I think if you balance out all the issues we've been talking about the efficiencies of being closer together from the sustainability point of view, the benefits of being close to where you work to reduce the amount of commuting, etc. The benefits that have been implied by words around identity and diversity. Being close to people who are not like you is what cities are about. That's the ones that have survived longest, the Jerusalems of this world, I mean, in that sense. I would say, in the end, outweigh the health risks. Obviously, you're a specialist, but am I not right in saying that some of the densest cities in the world, including this one, responded to COVID better than elsewhere?
Well,
because of the efficiency of the health system? I mean, that's what I've heard.
Well, Singapore could be an exception because the governance system is very strong and the health system is very well provided for. It's also true that 60% of the world lives in cities today, accounting for 70% of energy consumption, 80% of carbon emissions. So there is a disproportionate nature to overconsumption as well.
My point earlier was, yes, that's true, but if you design, organize, and manage cities in such a way that you reduce the amount, the impact on the global planet's health is much more significant than anything else you might do in a farm or a tiny village. So that's where probably we disagree.
Thank you.
Abhas?
So I think Ricky is exactly right. And I just want to add a couple of things to what he said, which is that if the entire world moved to the density of, say, Seoul, the carbon footprint of the world would go dramatically down. Yeah. So cities are incredibly efficient if managed well. Yeah. But to answer your question about deurbanization, I think it goes back to what Peter was saying earlier, which is that in terms of pandemics and shocks, we need to start thinking in terms of systems, and we need to start thinking about scenarios, and we need to design systems that fail gracefully. That's a term that we use a lot, graceful failure. And I'll give you an example of a system that didn't fail gracefully, which is the Fukushima Daiichi, the nuclear power plant. Nobody had thought that what if we have a tsunami with a 20-foot wave or whatever. So those are the kind of questions we need to start asking ourselves when we design systems. And that, frankly, in public policy, it's still not embedded. So I think that's one takeaway.
Curiously enough, you mentioned Fukushima. What was remarkable about that cataclysm was that it led to energy deregulation in Japan. Basically, it discredited nuclear for a period of time. It also saw the uplift in clean energy. And so out of the cataclysm, as Phoenix from the flames arose, a greater awareness of the green agenda, and also this culture of resilience for towns like Higashi Matsushima. I am totally in agreement that I think that we should be still advocating for cities as opposed to the decentralization, and to be able to think about urban systems that are embracing biodiversity and the green agenda to ensure that we can be reducing those carbon emissions.
I mean, just as a final comment, I agree that you wouldn't de-urbanize in order to avoid the kind of catastrophes we faced as a result of COVID-19, because the next catastrophe isn't going to necessarily look like a pandemic. It could be something else which is not related at all to the density or things like that. So I would just bear in mind that the surprises and shocks we experience in the future will often come from the left field, not something we are looking out for. It just surprises us. And the question then is, do we have that ability to bounce back, to adapt to that? And if you de-urbanize, remember that there are a lot of costs that go with de-urbanization. I don't mean the cost of de-urbanization, but you'll give up, you know, the comfortable life that we've all got used to. And I guess economic growth will take a huge hit if you decide you want to de-urbanize. So these are trade-offs which are not so simple to make.
Thank you. Actually, it's a very, very deep conversation. Maybe we can continue after this to talk about it, because there are a lot of studies that show that it's not the density that's causing the problem also. So anyway, this conversation can go on. So I just want to stop here because we've just hit the time, and I'd like to really, let's put our hands together to thank our panelists for a great conversation.